The radar screen flickered with an impossible signature. Staff Sergeant Martinez leaned closer to the green glow, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the blip moving across Afghan airspace at 280 knots. The transponder code was all wrong, showing an aircraft that had been officially declared lost 6 months ago, its pilot presumed dead after a catastrophic engagement over the Hindu Kush Mountains. "Sir, you need to see this," Martinez called across the dimly lit command center at Bagram Airfield. His voice carried that particular tension reserved for moments when reality stops making sense. The night shift had been routine until now, monitoring friendly air traffic, coordinating supply runs, tracking the occasional drone patrol. But this signature defied explanation. Colonel James Reeves approached the console, his weathered face creased with skepticism. 28 years of service had taught him that radar ghosts usually had mundane explanations. Equipment malfunctions, atmospheric conditions, occasionally a smuggler's modified aircraft. But as he studied the display, his expression shifted from irritation to bewilderment. The aircraft was following a precise flight path, maintaining military protocols, broadcasting encrypted authentication codes that matched perfectly with those assigned to Captain Alara Ghost, Thorne's A-10 Thunderbolt II. The same aircraft that had been blown apart by surface-to-air missiles during Operation Enduring Sentinel, its wreckage scattered across an unreachable valley where Taliban forces controlled every approach route. "Run a diagnostic on the system," Reeves ordered, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen the after-action reports, reviewed the satellite imagery. 3 missiles had converged on Thorne's position simultaneously. The explosion had been visible from orbit. No pilot could have survived that kind of impact, and certainly no aircraft could have remained flyable. Yet here was her transponder code, her encrypted authentication sequence, even her distinctive flight pattern, that slight deviation to port every 40 seconds that she developed as a nervous habit during her first deployment. Martinez ran the diagnostic twice, then a third time. Every system checked out perfectly. "Sir, the aircraft is requesting permission to land," the communications operator announced, his headset crackling with static. "Standard approach vectors, military protocol. But sir," he paused, removing one earpiece, "the voice signature analysis is showing a 97% match for Captain Thorne." The command center fell silent except for the steady hum of electronics and air conditioning. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness stretched across the Afghan desert, punctuated by the distant glow of perimeter lights. Somewhere in that darkness, an impossible aircraft was approaching their runway, piloted by a ghost who had somehow found her way home from the dead. Reeves reached for his secure phone, knowing this conversation would wake generals and spook intelligence analysts across 3 time zones. Because either their equipment had suffered a complete systemic failure, or Captain Alara Thorne had just accomplished something that would rewrite every manual on survival, evasion, and escape. The war in Afghanistan had produced many legends, but tonight they were about to witness the birth of a myth that would outlive them all. In the sky above Bagram, running lights blinked steadily through the darkness, carrying secrets that would challenge everything they thought they knew about loss, determination, and the unbreakable will of a pilot who refused to let her story end in that distant mountain valley. Captain Alara Ghost Thorne had earned her call sign during flight school, not for any mystical ability to vanish, but for her uncanny talent for appearing exactly where enemies least expected her. Instructors had initially dismissed her as too small, too quiet, too analytical for close air support missions. She stood barely 5'4" in her flight boots, spoke in measured tones that some mistook for uncertainty, and approached every tactical problem with methodical precision that slower minds interpreted as hesitation. But in the cockpit of an A-10, Thorne transformed. The twin-engine attack aircraft became an extension of her will, its GAU-8 cannon a surgical instrument in her hands. She could thread the massive jet between mountain peaks with the delicacy of a surgeon, deliver ordnance with mathematical precision, and extract maximum performance from every system. What her peers accomplished through aggression and bravado, she achieved through intelligence and timing. Her squadron mates had learned to respect that quiet competence, though respect came slowly in a world that measured worth in testosterone and volume. During her first combat deployment, some had made jokes about the library girl who studied technical manuals during downtime instead of joining poker games. That mockery died during a mission over Helmand Province when Thorne single-handedly broke up a Taliban offensive. Her precise cannon runs saving an entire infantry company from being overrun. The ghost call sign stuck, but its meaning evolved. She didn't disappear, she made enemy positions disappear with surgical strikes that left friendly forces untouched. Taliban fighters began referring to her aircraft as the Silent Death, reporting attacks where targets simply vanished without warning, destroyed by an opponent they never saw coming. Her promotion to captain came ahead of schedule, along with recognition that made her uncomfortable. Thorne preferred the technical aspects of flying to the politics of leadership, but command noticed her ability to bring every pilot home safely from increasingly dangerous missions. She studied enemy tactics with academic intensity, memorized terrain features like poetry, and maintained her aircraft with perfectionist attention that mechanics found both admirable and slightly obsessive. 6 months ago, during her third deployment, Thorne had volunteered for Operation Enduring Sentinel, a high-risk mission to eliminate a Taliban command structure hidden in the Spin Gar Mountains. Intelligence reports indicated minimal air defense threats, but intelligence reports had been wrong before. She'd spent 3 days studying satellite imagery, weather patterns, and escape routes before accepting the assignment. The mission briefing had been routine. Primary target, a fortified compound containing high-value Taliban commanders. Secondary objectives, communications equipment and weapons caches. Expected resistance, small arms fire, possibly some RPGs. The threat assessment mentioned possible surface-to-air missiles but rated the probability as low. Thorne had raised questions about the intelligence reliability, but her concerns were noted and dismissed. She'd taken off alone that morning, her A-10 loaded with precision-guided munitions and a full load of 13 cannon rounds. The flight to target had been uneventful, the Afghan landscape passing below in familiar patterns of brown mountains and green valleys. Her radio communications remained clear and professional, reporting waypoints and system status with characteristic precision. What happened next had become the subject of intense investigation and speculation. Official records showed her aircraft had been engaged by multiple surface-to-air missiles while conducting the attack run. Satellite imagery confirmed 3 separate missile impacts and a massive explosion. Search and rescue operations found scattered debris but no ejection seat activation, no emergency beacon transmission, no pilot. The aftermath had been professionally devastating for everyone involved. Intelligence analysts faced difficult questions about their threat assessments. Mission planners reviewed every decision. Her squadron mates struggled with survivors' guilt and anger at losing someone they'd finally learned to appreciate. Colonel Reeves himself had written the letter to her family, choosing his words carefully while struggling to explain how such a competent pilot could simply vanish. Now, 6 months later, that impossible transponder code was forcing everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about that day in the mountains. The communications operator's voice cut through the command center's tension like a blade through silk. "Sir, the aircraft is 5 minutes out. Visual contact confirmed by tower personnel. It's definitely an A-10, sir, but—" He paused, consulting his instruments with obvious confusion. Tower reports extensive battle damage. Sections of wing surface missing, fuselage scarred, landing gear deployed manually. But she's flying steady, maintaining proper approach speed. Colonel Reeves felt his chest tighten. Battle damage suggested combat survival, which raised questions more troubling than simple resurrection. If Thorne had somehow survived the initial attack, where had she been for 6 months? The Taliban weren't known for taking prisoners, especially not American pilots. And how had she managed to keep an extensively damaged aircraft operational for this long? "Get me a direct line to Theater Command," he ordered. "Priority 1 classification. And wake up our intelligence team. They're going to want to debrief whatever just crawled out of the mountains." Martinez continued tracking the approaching aircraft, noting flight characteristics that suggested severe mechanical compromise. The A-10 was flying lower and slower than normal approach profiles, with slight control surface irregularities indicating possible hydraulic damage. Yet the pilot maintained precise heading and altitude, demonstrating the kind of skill that kept damaged aircraft in the air through pure determination. "Visual confirmation of tail number," the tower reported. 78047, that's definitely Captain Thorne's bird, sir." The number hit Reeves like physical blow. He'd memorized that tail number while writing casualty reports and reviewing mission footage. Aircraft 78047 had been Thorne's regular assignment. The A-10 she'd flown on 43 previous missions without sustaining significant damage. The same aircraft that intelligence analysts had conclusively determined had been destroyed over the Hindu Kush. "Sir, we have a problem," Martinez announced, his voice tight with concern. "The aircraft isn't responding to standard radio calls. Tower's been trying to establish communication for the past 3 minutes. The transponder is working, authentication codes are valid, but there's no pilot response." The implication sent ice through Reeves' veins. Either the pilot was incapacitated, or something else entirely was bringing that aircraft home. In the post-9/11 world, unmanned aircraft approaching military installations triggered very specific protocols, none of which ended well for the aircraft in question. "Get me 2 F-16s scrambled for intercept," he ordered. "Visual identification and escort only, weapons safe unless I give explicit authorization. And someone get our medical team standing by. If there's a pilot in that cockpit, she's going to need immediate attention." Outside, the first hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon, casting the desert in subtle shades of gray and amber. The approaching A-10's navigation lights blinked steadily against the fatting stars, following a perfect glide path toward the runway. But the silence from the cockpit suggested that whatever was bringing Captain Thorne home might not be the woman they remembered. The F-16s lifted off with afterburners blazing, their twin engines screaming defiance at the pre-dawn quiet. Within minutes, they were flanking the approaching A-10, their pilots reporting visual contact with an aircraft that looked like it had survived a war zone. Panel sections were missing, exposing internal structure. The canopy showed spiderweb crack patterns and what appeared to be bullet holes stitched across the fuselage in precise lines. "Viper lead to Bagram Tower," came the radio call from the lead F-16. "Visual on the A-10. Severe battle damage confirmed, but aircraft appears stable. No visible pilot movement in the cockpit. Canopy is intact but heavily damaged. Recommend emergency services standing by." The mystery deepened with every passing minute. An extensively damaged aircraft, flying perfect approaches with no pilot communication, carrying authentication codes from a mission that had supposedly ended in complete destruction. It was either the most elaborate hoax in military history, or something had happened in those mountains that challenged basic assumptions about survival, physics, and human endurance. As the impossible aircraft continued its approach to Bagram's main runway, Colonel Reeves found himself hopping for a miracle while preparing for a nightmare. Because in his experience, when dead pilots came home after 6 months, they rarely brought good news with them. The A-10 touched down with the delicate precision of a master pilot compensating for severely compromised systems. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it rolled down the runway, their red and blue lights painting the pre-dawn darkness in urgent colors. The Thunderbolt's damaged landing gear held, though observers noted the aircraft settling to starboard as hydraulic pressure finally failed completely. Captain Thorne's voice crackled through the radio for the first time in 6 months, weak but unmistakably hers. Bagram Tower, Ghost 78047 requesting emergency services. Pilot conscious, aircraft secured. I'm home. The simple words carried weight that statistics and after-action reports could never capture. Colonel Reeves watched through the tower windows as the aircraft came to a complete stop, its engines winding down with mechanical exhaustion. Emergency crews surrounded the A-10 immediately, but their approach was cautious. Nobody knew what condition they'd find the pilot in, or what stories she might tell about her 6-month absence. Medical teams positioned their equipment while security personnel established a perimeter. Standard protocol for returning POWs included immediate medical evaluation, psychological assessment, and intelligence debriefing. But nothing about this situation followed standard protocol. Pilots didn't survive surface-to-air missile attacks, keep damaged aircraft operational for 6 months, then fly home without explanation. The canopy opened with a mechanical whine that suggested manual operation. Thorne's helmet appeared first, then her shoulders as she struggled to extract herself from the cramped cockpit. Even from the tower, observers could see she moved with obvious difficulty, her usually precise movements replaced by careful, measured motions that spoke of injury and exhaustion. Ground crews positioned a ladder, and slowly, methodically, Captain Alara Thorne climbed down from the aircraft that had somehow carried her home. Her flight suit was stained and patched, her boots worn down to the leather, her face bearing marks that suggested months of exposure to elements and stress. But she was alive, standing on Afghan soil, breathing air that 6 months ago had seemed forever beyond her reach. "Sir," Martinez called from his station, "we're receiving priority traffic from Theater Command. They want Captain Thorne isolated immediately upon landing. No contact with squadron personnel until intelligence can complete initial assessment." Reeves nodded grimly. Standard procedure, but it felt wrong to treat a returning pilot like a security threat. Still, regulations existed for reasons that usually became apparent only in hindsight. Whatever had happened during Thorne's absence, the full story would need careful evaluation before she could be truly welcomed home. As medical personnel approached with a stretcher, Thorne waved them off, insisting she could walk under her own power. Her first steps were unsteady, but she moved with growing confidence toward the waiting vehicles. Behind her, the battered A-10 sat like a monument to human determination, its scarred surfaces telling stories that would take weeks to fully decode. "Medical team reports pilot appears stable but significantly underweight," came the radio update. "Visible injuries consistent with extended survival situation. She's requesting to speak with her squadron commander, but following protocols for isolated debriefing first." The sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. For the first time in 6 months, those colors illuminated a complete puzzle instead of missing pieces and unanswered questions. Captain Thorne was home, her aircraft was secured, and somewhere in the intelligence community, analysts were preparing for conversations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about survival in hostile territory. But for now, in this moment, the only thing that mattered was the simple fact of her presence. Ghost had returned from the dead, and the war in Afghanistan had just become a little bit stranger, a little bit more hopeful, and infinitely more complicated. The debriefing room felt sterile and impersonal, its white walls and fluorescent lighting designed to extract truth through psychological pressure. Captain Thorne sat across from a panel of intelligence officers, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. The questions had been relentless, methodical, designed to probe every detail of her 6-month absence. Major Patricia Vance led the interrogation with professional courtesy that barely masked deep suspicion. The intelligence officer had built her career on understanding enemy capabilities and friendly vulnerabilities, but Thorne's story challenged fundamental assumptions about both. Surface-to-air missiles didn't leave survivors. Taliban forces didn't provide medical care to captured American pilots. And damaged aircraft didn't remain operational for months without proper maintenance facilities. "Let's go through it again, Captain," Vance said, consulting her tablet. The missile impacts occurred at approximately 14:30 hours local time. You maintain that your aircraft remained flyable despite taking 3 direct hits. Thorne's voice remained steady despite obvious fatigue. 2 direct hits, 1 proximity detonation. The first missile took out my starboard engine and most of the electrical systems. Second impact damaged the port wing and compromised hydraulics. The third exploded close enough to pepper the fuselage with shrapnel, but didn't cause catastrophic structural failure. Our satellite imagery shows a massive explosion consistent with complete aircraft destruction, Vance pressed. How do you explain that discrepancy? "I jettisoned remaining ordnance and used the explosion as cover," Thorne replied. "Emergency procedures for missile engagement include immediate ordnance disposal to prevent sympathetic detonation. The satellite probably captured my weapons cooking off, not my aircraft being destroyed." The explanation was technically plausible but statistically improbable. Modern surface-to-air missiles were designed to destroy aircraft, not damage them sufficiently to create spectacular explosions while leaving the primary target flyable. Yet here sat living proof that improbable didn't mean impossible. "Where did you land?" asked Captain James Morrison, the squadron intelligence officer who had written her casualty report 6 months ago. His discomfort was obvious. Interrogating someone whose death he'd officially certified created cognitive dissonance that showed in every gesture. "A valley approximately 40 kilometers southwest of the target area," Thorne answered. "Remote location, minimal Taliban presence, fresh water available. I spent the first month conducting basic repairs using salvaged materials and waiting for search and rescue operations." "No SAR operations reached your location," Morrison noted. "Why didn't you activate your emergency beacon?" "ELT was destroyed in the first missile impact. Backup radio had limited range and battery life. I established a transmission schedule but received no response to my emergency calls." The timeline felt wrong to Vance. Search and rescue operations had covered the reported area extensively, using every available asset to locate signs of pilot survival. Heat signatures, communications intercepts, visual reconnaissance, nothing had indicated Thorne's presence in the region she claimed to have occupied. "Captain, our records show no emergency transmissions from your area during the relevant time period," Vance stated flatly. "Ground teams found no evidence of aircraft wreckage at the coordinates you've provided. How do you explain these contradictions?" Thorne met her gaze without flinching. "I moved the aircraft 3 times during the first month to avoid Taliban patrols, covered the wreckage with local materials between repair sessions. As for communications, I was operating with severely limited power and may not have had sufficient signal strength to reach your receivers." Every answer was reasonable individually, but collectively, they painted a picture that strained credibility. Successful aircraft concealment in hostile territory for extended periods required resources and expertise that single pilots didn't typically possess. Yet Thorne's detailed knowledge of local geography and repair procedures suggested genuine experience rather than fabrication. "Tell us about the repairs," Morrison requested. "Specifically, how you managed to restore flight capability to an aircraft with 2 missile hits and extensive shrapnel damage." This was where Thorne's story became truly remarkable. For 3 hours, Captain Thorne walked the intelligence panel through a masterclass in survival engineering that would have impressed mechanics with decades of experience. She described using salvaged aluminum from her ordnance to patch fuselage holes, rewiring electrical systems with copper stripped from the target area, and fabricating replacement hydraulic lines from materials scavenged during nighttime reconnaissance missions. The A-10 was designed for battlefield damage tolerance, she explained, sketching aircraft systems on a whiteboard with the precision of an engineering instructor. Redundant flight controls, widely separated engines, manual backup for most critical systems. What the designers probably didn't anticipate was someone having 6 months to systematically restore functionality using improvised materials. Major Vance studied the technical drawings, comparing them with maintenance manuals and damage assessment protocols. Thorne's modifications were crude but mechanically sound, showing deep understanding of aircraft systems and creative problem-solving under extreme constraints. The intelligence officer had to admit that the repairs were theoretically possible, though practically unprecedented. "How did you obtain tools and materials?" Morrison asked. "The Taliban controlled that entire region." "Taliban patrols followed predictable patterns," Thorne replied. "I mapped their routes during the first month and identified safe corridors for movement. There were several abandoned villages in the valley, bombed out during earlier fighting but still containing useful materials. Metal roofing, electrical wire, even some basic tools that previous occupants had left behind." "You're describing months of covert movement through enemy territory," Vance observed. "A single detection would have meant capture or death. How did you avoid Taliban forces for such an extended period?" Thorne's expression darkened slightly. "I didn't always avoid them. There were encounters, but Taliban fighters aren't expecting a lone American pilot to be conducting guerrilla operations from a hidden aircraft. They were looking for rescue attempts, not someone who had already been written off as dead." The room fell silent as implications settled. If Thorne had engaged enemy forces during her absence, intelligence analysts would need to correlate her activities with Taliban casualty reports and operational disruptions in the region. Single operators rarely survived sustained contact with organized enemy forces, but exceptional circumstances sometimes produced exceptional results. "Captain, we need to discuss your physical condition upon return," the medical officer interjected. "You're significantly underweight, showing signs of chronic malnutrition and exposure. How did you sustain yourself for 6 months in a remote valley?" "Local vegetation, stream water, occasionally small game when I could catch it safely," Thorne answered. "The area wasn't completely barren, some fruit trees, edible plants if you know what to look for. Survival training covers basic foraging, though 6 months pushed those skills to their limits." Everything she described was technically possible, but the combination of aircraft repair, enemy evasion, survival foraging, and ultimately successful extraction pushed probability to its absolute margins. Either Captain Thorne had accomplished one of the most remarkable survival feats in modern military history, or she was maintaining an elaborate deception with extraordinary attention to detail. Major Vance made a decision that would influence everything that followed. "Captain, we're going to verify every element of your account. Satellite imagery, communications logs, Taliban intelligence reports, everything we can access. Until that verification is complete, you'll remain in isolated quarters under medical observation." "I understand," Thorne replied. "But Major, while you're conducting that verification, I recommend reviewing your search and rescue protocols. If one pilot can evade detection for 6 months, others might be doing the same. You might have more missing personnel who are actually survivors waiting for extraction." The suggestion sent ice through everyone present, because it implied that other confirmed casualties might actually be alive in remote locations, conducting their own desperate struggles for survival and return. 3 days into the verification process, Major Vance faced a problem that kept her awake at night. Every detail of Thorne's story was checking out. Satellite imagery revealed camouflaged aircraft debris at the coordinates she'd provided, cleverly concealed using techniques that explained why initial search efforts had missed it. Communications analysis showed faint emergency transmissions that had been dismissed as atmospheric interference. Even Taliban intelligence intercepts mentioned unexplained equipment losses and personnel casualties in the region Thorn claimed to have operated in. The physical evidence was overwhelming, but psychological assessment raised different concerns. Captain Morrison had interviewed dozens of returned POWs in survival situations, and Thorne's mental state didn't match typical patterns. She showed none of the hypervigilance, emotional volatility, or social withdrawal common among personnel who had endured extended isolation and life-threatening stress. Instead, she demonstrated remarkable composure, detailed memory retention, and what psychologists classified as mission-focused orientation, the mentality of someone who had never stopped being a soldier, even under impossible circumstances. It was admirable and deeply unsettling in equal measure. Her stress indicators are actually lower than baseline measurements from her pre-deployment evaluation, reported Captain Lisa Chen, the flight surgeon responsible for Thorne's medical assessment. Blood pressure, heart rate, cortisol levels, everything suggests someone who has adapted successfully to extreme stress rather than being traumatized by it. Vance reviewed the psychological profile while studying reconnaissance photographs that showed Thorne's hidden aircraft. The camouflage was masterful, using natural materials and tactical principles that suggested advanced training beyond standard pilot requirements. Either Thorne had hidden talents, or 6 months of necessity had transformed her into something more than an attack pilot. "What about her squadron integration?" Vance asked. "How are her peers responding to her return?" "Mixed reactions," Chen replied diplomatically. "Some are excited to have her back, others are suspicious about the timeline and circumstances. There are questions about why she didn't attempt to contact friendly forces sooner, why she chose independent action over trying to reach established safe zones." The questions reflected broader issues about Thorne's decision-making during her absence. Standard survival training emphasized establishing contact with friendly forces as quickly as possible, not conducting extended independent operations. Her choice to remain hidden while repairing her aircraft suggested priorities that military psychologists found difficult to categorize. "Has she expressed interest in returning to flight status?" Vance inquired. "That's complicated," Chen answered. "She's physically capable and mentally stable, but her aircraft expertise has evolved significantly during her absence. She's describing repair techniques and survival applications that aren't covered in any manual. It's like she's developed her own advanced maintenance curriculum through necessity." The implications were profound. If Thorne's improvised techniques proved reliable, they could revolutionize battlefield maintenance procedures and pilot survival training. But integrating such innovations required understanding exactly how she developed them, which meant accepting that her story was true in all its improbable details. "Major Vance," interrupted a communications specialist, "we've just received priority intelligence from Theater Command. Taliban communications intercepts from the past 6 months include references to the Ghost aircraft conducting attacks against their supply convoys. Descriptions match an A-10 operating in the region Captain Thorne claims to have occupied." The revelation changed everything. If Taliban forces had been reporting attacks by a Ghost aircraft, Thorne hadn't simply been hiding and repairing her A-10. She'd been conducting combat operations against enemy forces while officially listed as killed in action. The tactical implications were staggering, but the political and legal complications were even more complex. Vance felt the investigation slipping into territory that would require involvement from Theater Command, Pentagon intelligence, and possibly congressional oversight. Because if an officially dead pilot had been conducting unauthorized combat operations for 6 months, every assumption about pilot training, survival protocols, and battlefield accountability needed immediate review. "Get me a secure line to General Morrison," she ordered, "and wake up everyone with security clearance for compartmented programs." This situation just became a lot more complicated than a simple survival story. Outside, Captain Thorne continued her medical recovery, apparently unaware that her return was causing a crisis of policy and protocol that would influence American military operations for years to come. She had survived the impossible and accomplished the unprecedented, but her greatest challenge might be convincing her own command structure to accept the implications of what she had achieved. General Patricia Morrison had built her career on making impossible decisions under impossible circumstances, but Captain Thorne's situation presented complexities that challenged even her extensive experience. The secure video conference included Theater Command, Pentagon intelligence, and legal advisors whose collective expertise covered everything from international law to psychological operations. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," General Morrison began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic confusion. "Captain Thorne was shot down 6 months ago, officially declared KIA, but actually spent that time conducting unauthorized combat operations against Taliban forces while repairing her aircraft in a hidden location." Major Vance nodded grimly. "Intelligence correlations suggest she was responsible for at least 12 separate attacks against enemy convoys and supply depots. Taliban communications describe coordinated strikes using tactics that match Thorne's documented combat patterns." The legal implications were staggering. Officially dead personnel conducting combat operations existed in a gray zone that military law had never contemplated. Questions of chain of command, mission authorization, and accountability became meaningless when applied to someone who didn't officially exist. "What's her current status and condition?" asked Colonel James Patterson, the Pentagon's senior legal advisor. "Medical evaluation shows remarkable physical and psychological stability," Vance reported. "She's requesting return to flight status and seems genuinely puzzled by our reluctance to grant immediate clearance. From her perspective, she survived a combat incident, conducted battlefield repairs, and resumed operations against enemy forces. She sees it as exemplary performance rather than unauthorized activity." General Morrison studied reconnaissance photographs of Thorne's hidden aircraft and improvised repair work. The technical achievement was undeniably impressive, but the strategic implications were potentially explosive. If news of unauthorized combat operations became public, congressional hearings and media scrutiny would follow inevitably. "How do we classify her activities during the missing period?" Patterson inquired. "Were these combat operations conducted under Standing Row, independent action, or something else entirely?" "That's the problem," Vance admitted. "Thorne maintains she was following her original mission parameters, which included authorized engagement of enemy forces and equipment. She argues that her survival and continued operations were natural extensions of her assigned duties." The argument had legal merit but practical complications. Mission authorization didn't typically cover 6-month independent campaigns conducted by pilots who had been declared dead. Yet charging Thorne with unauthorized operations seemed both legally questionable and morally reprehensible given her survival achievement. "What's the intelligence value of her activities?" asked General Morrison, "beyond the tactical impact on Taliban operations?" "Significant," replied Colonel Sarah Kim from Theater Intelligence. "Thorne's observations of Taliban movement patterns, supply routes, and operational procedures provide detailed insight into enemy activities in a region we've had limited access to. Her information is current, comprehensive, and operationally relevant." The intelligence windfall complicated disciplinary considerations. Punishing Thorne for unauthorized operations would also mean discrediting intelligence that could save American lives and improve operational effectiveness. The practical benefits of her survival actions were becoming harder to separate from questions about proper military authority and discipline. "General, we need to consider precedent," Patterson warned. "How we handle this situation will influence future cases involving missing personnel, survival situations, and independent operations. Our decision becomes doctrine for everyone who comes after." General Morrison understood the weight of that responsibility. Military precedent shaped behavior during crisis situations when personnel had to make life-and-death decisions without higher guidance. The wrong precedent could encourage reckless independence, while overly harsh discipline might discourage survival innovation and tactical flexibility. "What's Captain Thorne's perspective on all this?" she asked. "Has anyone actually discussed these implications with her directly?" "She's been focused on returning to flight status," Vance answered. "Her primary concern seems to be rejoining her squadron and resuming normal operations. She hasn't expressed awareness of the policy complications her survival has created." The observation highlighted a fundamental disconnect between Thorne's tactical mindset and the strategic concerns her actions had generated. She had solved immediate problems with available resources, while higher command grappled with implications that extended far beyond individual survival. "I want to speak with Captain Thorne directly," General Morrison decided. "Face to face, off the record initially. Before we make policy decisions that affect her future and everyone else's, I need to understand exactly what happened in those mountains and why she made the choices she did." The general's decision would prove pivotal, because understanding Thorne's motivations was the key to resolving questions that had no clear answers in existing military doctrine. The meeting took place in a small conference room at Bagram, with only General Morrison and Captain Thorne present. Outside, the morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and purple, while inside, two professional soldiers discussed events that would influence military policy for decades to come. "Captain, I've read your debriefing reports and technical assessments," General Morrison began. "What I want to understand is why. You had opportunities to attempt extraction, chances to signal rescue forces, options to surrender to local authorities. Why did you choose 6 months of independent operations instead?" Thorne considered the question carefully before responding. "General, with respect, I don't think I chose anything. Each day presented problems that required solutions. Fix the aircraft or abandon it. Avoid enemy patrols or engage them. Find food and water or face starvation. The accumulation of daily survival decisions eventually became what others are calling a campaign. But you must have realized that your actions would have consequences, that operating independently for extended periods would create complications." "I thought about it," Thorne admitted. "But I also thought about Taliban forces using my abandoned aircraft for propaganda purposes, intelligence they might extract from salvage, and capabilities they might develop from studying American technology. Denying them those advantages seemed more important than following textbook protocols." The answer revealed thinking that extended beyond personal survival to strategic considerations. Thorne hadn't simply been trying to stay alive. She'd been conducting a private war to deny enemy forces intelligence and symbolic victories they might have gained from her presumed death. "The attacks against Taliban convoys and supply depots," General Morrison continued, "those went far beyond denying enemy access to your aircraft. You were conducting offensive operations." "Target identification, sir," Thorne corrected quietly. "Every engagement was against legitimate military targets conducting activities that threatened American personnel and operations. I had ammunition, fuel, and intelligence. Using those assets against enemy forces seemed consistent with my duties as an American combat pilot." Her logic was impeccable within its own framework, but it ignored fundamental questions about authority, coordination, and accountability. She had appointed herself judge and executor of tactical operations without higher guidance or oversight, relying entirely on her own assessment of threats and opportunities. Captain, didn't you consider that your family, your squadron, everyone who cared about you believed you were dead? That your survival imposed emotional costs on people who had grieved your loss? This question struck deeper than tactical or legal issues, touching on human connections that Thorne had perhaps tried not to think about during her isolation. Her expression shifted slightly, showing the first crack in the professional composure she'd maintained throughout weeks of debriefing. "I did consider it, General," she said finally. "Every day. But I also considered that more families would lose people if I didn't use available resources to interdict enemy operations. The arithmetic seemed clear. My personal relationships weighed against potential American casualties that I might prevent." The calculation revealed a mindset that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal considerations to an extraordinary degree. It was simultaneously admirable and troubling, representing dedication that bordered on obsessive. "What kept you going?" General Morrison asked. "6 months of isolation, constant danger, minimal resources. Most people would have found a way to surrender or extract rather than continuing to fight alone." Thorne was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at mountains that had been her home and battleground. When she finally spoke, her voice carried emotions that hadn't appeared in any official report. "I kept thinking about Lieutenant Rodriguez," she said, "young pilot from my squadron who was killed during my second deployment. Taliban mortar got lucky during a close support mission. I was supposed to be providing cover for him, but I was 60 seconds late getting into position because I'd been overly cautious approaching the target area." The confession explained motivations that weren't apparent in tactical analysis or psychological evaluation. Thorne wasn't just fighting Taliban forces. She was trying to prevent other Rodriguez casualties through her own aggressive action. "So this was about guilt," General Morrison observed. "This was about effectiveness," Thorne corrected. "Rodriguez died because I